examples have now detailed them in their own words in these emails, computer codes, and so on, talking about tricks to hide the decline in temperature, putting in all capitals that says, insert very artificial decline here. All sorts of other claims in which they're admitting they know exactly what they're doing. They use the words fudge and so on, fudge factors for their data to get the desired results.
And now the controlled corporate media is teaching us hide the decline, fudge. That doesn't mean what you think anymore. That means save the polar bears.
Right. The most embarrassing exercise was when the media spent about 8 days telling us the trick was really a scientific colloquialism, and it means different things to people.
Yes.
And I said, that's great. What about the word hide? Or the decline? But they didn't focus on that. They said, well, trick doesn't mean trick. The reasonable meanings and the plain meanings aren't reasonable. Only the unreasonable extrapolations are what they really meant. And they're saying it was in the heat.
And you've also got statements like, this is just horrible. We can't account for the decline in temperatures. How do we hide it? I mean, it's so clear. And then they're persecuting other scientists and working with government, colluding. Oh, after I explained it to the government, they're not going to release it. Now that they know what type of people these are. And one of the heads of the UN propaganda got questioned by a filmmaker Friday in Copenhagen. It's up on Infowars.com. We'll play the video later, folks. And it's a press conference. He gets up to ask the question, and the guy says, oh, I don't talk about things that come from people that are this immoral. You know, this comes from immoral people, and these are private emails. And he has armed guard come in and start grabbing them and dragging them out. I mean, these people are authoritarian, very authoritarian.
Let me tell you something. I've got a chapter in Red Hot Lies that I quote these people all over the place, openly wistful about, if we only had an enlightened totalitarian system like China, we could get this agenda in place. And that argument is now out in the open. I believe it's Tom Friedman at the New York Times has been recently making it. Oh, if only we had that system. We need to suspend certain liberties, just certain liberties, and just for a little while, because democracy, they say, is getting in the way, and people who we have been unable to convince them to do what's in their own self-interest. We're going to have to make it happen somehow. And I quote them throughout that chapter. They really are getting unabashed about this because no one's calling them on it. And instead, as you pointed out, the media are covering for them. I mean, thrown in, full-out advocates, participants in the global warming industry. They've always been sensationalists. But this goes far beyond that, and I detail that in fact, the opening chapter. So none of what's come out recently are revelations. They're all affirmations. By the way, there was not one personal email that we can find so far, yet they assign that to everything. They say it all shows science as it should be, and yet it's terrible that these things got out and so on.
But the good news is, Christopher Horner, the public isn't buying the Associated Press and CNN telling us nothing to see here, move along. I mean, do you agree that this is devastating? Because all the fraud and all the exposés were building, and through the grassroots, the people were learning, and people were seeing Fortune 500 get behind it, and really a backlash was already there, and then now you're going to tax what plants breathe, and Al Gore making all this money. I mean, is this not devastating them?
I truly believe it is, and again, their reaction tells quite a lot, and the lengths to which the media are going to stop their agenda from taking water is instructive. Now, what are we going to see? Well, the president is talking about, in fact, The Guardian has reported this. I wrote an article in the March issue of what's called Engage, which is the Federalist Society's publication, detailing how what's called a congressional executive agreement, which we have plenty of. For example, NAFTA is a treaty that we decided wasn't a treaty, and therefore you waive the Constitution's Article 2, Section 2 requirement of two-thirds ratification. Two-thirds ratification will never happen for this. So what the president, according to The Guardian now, the old red herself, The Guardian, has reported that the administration is briefing European diplomats, as I've also written, to prepare them for the prospect that we need to write this in a way that it's got to be plausibly declared not a treaty, because then they can say all it takes is 50 plus 1 in both houses, and no amendment, up or down, no filibuster vote under what they call fast track. Now, there's precedent for this in the trade context, but not in a global energy rationing, selective, punitive wealth transfer scheme. So,
and then on top of it, he's saying if you don't ratify it, I'm still going to implement it.
Yeah, then we've got the EPA trying. Now, that doesn't satisfy the wealth transfer, and it doesn't bind us internationally. However, it will. You still can't possibly bury that in these enormous spending bills now, ladling more debt on my kids theirs, and EPA's threatening to do this. Here's what just so you know, nobody wants to take ownership of this hot potato. They were furious that Bush wouldn't start this rulemaking after we lost that Supreme Court case, that he kicked it into this administration. Now, recently, EPA has declared CO2 endangers human health and the environment, to which I first say, try living without it. But now they're going to say, we'll issue this finding, and it's being published tomorrow in the Federal Register. And then they're going to try something unlawful, which is to say, do sort of a half-arsed maneuver with it, so that the green groups then march into court, and they and the courts get assigned responsibility for this. In other words, they won't go all the way in implementing it, but they know that the green groups, under the Clean Air Act, can make them. So it's not really plausible deniability, but that's their route, Alex. They don't want to.
Sure. I mean, it's criminal. It's by stealth. It's creeping, like a spider creeping up your bed at night to bite you. Look at Schwarzenegger. He couldn't get the legislature to put a tax on TVs or ban big ones, so he just did it under the California Energy Agency. Look at what's happening in Washington State, where employers tax you now off how you drive, and they have to collect the money. I mean, they're already implementing this everywhere. We know under UNESCO they're brainwashing kids in public school. I mean, this is a criminal cult of pirates. How do we ever extricate ourselves from them? How do we ever remove them? Hopefully some type of criminal charges against these different scientists engaged in fraud. I mean, is there anything we can do to this gang of boobies?
Well, CEI, Competitive Enterprise Institute that I'm associated with, has petitioned EPA to reopen their record on the basis of the scandal that's been exposed, or I say affirmed. There are people looking into what are called key TAM issues, where you essentially sue on behalf of the king and recover the king's treasure, because, again, there's an intent to defraud on the face of these emails and in the annotated computer code. People are looking at RICO actions against these individuals because fraud could trigger that, and so on. So whether I know that, I don't know. There are attempts to whitewash at the various universities involved right now. I've got a notice of intent to sue NASA by the end of the year. It'll be January before I get around to it. If they don't cough up their equivalent of this data in these emails, because I've been denied for more than 2 years, and I finally had enough when this thing broke. And so we're going to have to use the courts just like they do. Now, if we get involved in this treaty, it has a provision that has a 3-year cooling-off period for getting out, which is 3 years to generate all sorts of, you saw what they did to the U.S. under Bush, 3 years of generating intense diplomatic and political pressure against America to stay in an energy rationing and wealth transfer scheme. So you can't get into this mess. Now, let me tell you something. There's a three-legged stool they're pushing. It's the Kyoto scheme, which on its face was not binding, but our courts might just implement it. But with the Law of the Sea Treaty, which has a tribunal, which we will have to implement their rulings here, and we are supposedly going to ratify in Obama's first term in office, in fact, next year. And then the International Criminal Court, which we're told we're going to re-sign the Rome Statute, the treaty creating the International Criminal Court. Well, you get those three, as he planned, and you've got a serious problem. You've got a very difficult problem to manage as a matter of law, because our courts are increasingly radicalized, as you know, but increasingly international. And the swing vote on this issue, quite clearly, is Justice Kennedy. And he's on record saying we need to find out what those nice Europeans think our Constitution says before we implement it ourselves. So we've got a problem. You don't get involved in the treaties, but
America is being swallowed by an unelected private offshore corporate government, the New World Order.
Well, let's just say there are people who have us in their sight, and they see us coming. Let me tell you something. Do you think Obama politically can afford to walk away from Copenhagen without some piece of paper in hand, even though it's going to be a transfer of wealth from here to there? Politically, knowing how politics works and his base in the media? No. So India and China and the rest of the world see him coming. They know when he goes over there on Friday, he has to give them whatever they want, because he cannot leave empty-handed from Copenhagen in an embarrassment twice in 1 year in his first year in office. So they see him coming. We have an amateur, but an amateur with all the wrong instincts and a very dangerous agenda. And therefore, let me just say this. We're going to be as active as we possibly can be through the courts here, through CEI, with whatever our resources will allow. And I'm hoping some private entities will stand up for once and stop trying to cut a deal. and fight back. And so
that's another big point you made. All these big corporations, if they're not behind the swindling, they've said, okay, I'll join you, just don't rape me. And that's what the EPA said last week, as you know. They said, look, all you big corporations get in line or we're going to selectively enforce. I mean, they're literally like a mobster beating up the little grocery store owner. When are we going to grow a backbone to these parasites and say no?
It's even worse than window insurance. What they were saying was tapping the cage and saying, you better pay me to protect you from my lunatic friend here. Be ashamed if this thing got out of the cage. But the problem is they also said it that day later, we plan on doing both. No matter what you pass in Congress, we plan on trying to do what we can done to the Clean Air Act anyway. Let me tell you about a provision in these two cap-and-trade bills real quickly. They're 500 pages different in size, okay? They're not the same bill. But they have one provision that was identically drafted and buried in both. In the Senate bill, it's called Section 707. And what it says is every law in the United States Code shall, not may, shall be implemented by the president as a CO2 suppression law, a carbon dioxide suppression global warming law.
It's a carbon dictatorship.